This is a familiar text to most who work with place names in Wales, since it offers spellings of the towns and villages of the country in an emphatically Welsh source. As we shall be exploring, it's a text of the second half of the 16th century, and therefore rarely provides the earliest written record of major place names, because those are often recorded in the medieval period. But not infrequently, it offers the earliest spelling with a modern-looking Welsh orthography, and sometimes it's the earliest record of a distinctively Welsh name when the place is otherwise known by an English one, as we shall see. Much of the administrative documentation in Wales, that's the stock in trade of those of us who study place names, served Anglo-Norman or English institutions, and most of it in the medieval period is found in Latin documents. Of course, there are numerous other Welsh language sources of this date and earlier that provide Welsh place name forms. Think in particular perhaps of the medieval verse and chronicles, but a particular value of this text is the degree of coverage across the country. Other Welsh language texts dip into names, as it were, according to their themes and local interests. This one gives national coverage. For these reasons, therefore, the valuable nature of the text and its ubiquity, its forms often appear even when only a small selection of early spellings is cited to illustrate the history of major settlement names, the length and breadth of Wales. It's readily recognised, even in works like this that do not detail their sources, by the distinctive date of circa 1566, which was given to it by its editor at the end of the 19th century. There's no doubt that this is a significant text in charting the history of names, with all the linguistic, cultural and historical information which they encode. It is also, I hope to convince you, although just a list, a rather interesting text which raises some intriguing questions. They include, what exactly is it? You will note that in my title I put the list of parishes in inverted commas, because although this is the description usually applied to it, it doesn't seem to me to be quite right. Why, where and by whom was it compiled, and when exactly? And perhaps above all, how? When you think about it, it's a pretty impressive achievement, especially if this is one individual's work. This is the much lauded earliest printed map of Wales, Humphrey Llwyd's Cambriae Typus, compiled in 1568 and first published posthumously in 1573. It was, of course, a great achievement and a great advance on previous mapping. And it is a map with all the surveying and drafting skills that involves, not a mere list of places. But on the other hand, compare the level of coverage. Here's a detail showing Llwyd's Ynys Môn, Anglesey, marking 18 settlements and some coastal features. And here, of practically the same date, is the Peniarth 147 list for Anglesey transferred onto a map. 74 settlements are named here. Compiling that from scratch would be quite an impressive achievement for someone who grew up on the island and perhaps took some time travelling around to complete and flesh out the list. But faced with equivalent coverage over the whole country, however, about 950 named places, it's a rather remarkable feat of mapping, a mapping out of the settlement geography of the whole of Wales. What is it? Was it compiled by correspondence with local scholars? Is it drawing on pre-existing written sources of one kind or another? Does it reflect a journey or a series of journeys? Lots of questions to discuss. Though I will confess at the beginning, have very many answers. Or rather, I found one answer presented, though I'm perhaps unreasonably and over-skeptically doubtful about accepting it. So in this paper this evening, I'm going to look at the text in two different ways. First, the text itself, the manuscript, the forms of the written text. What is it? What does the internal evidence suggest about it? What are the immediate parallels which might suggest possible sources or comparanda. Much of this I'm going to extrapolate from a detailed examination of the area we've already seen, Anglesey. Several reasons for this, beginning with the fact that Anglesey comes first in the list. Identifying all the names and comparing them in detail with other sources proves a fairly time-consuming task. And for me, this started as an incidental interest, a sidetrack from other research. So it would be fair to say that this is very much a provisional first look at a text which would bear a great deal more work. The second part of my paper this evening, having thought a bit about the nature and context of the text, is a close look at some of the place names themselves, both to more closely define what they offer, but also to reflect on some of the same questions from this point of view. Do the names themselves reveal anything about the nature and the motivation of the text? And this is as good a juncture as any to make this point. It's quite possible, as I've already suggested, that some of the fundamental questions about who put this together, when and how, have knowable answers, which I've not yet found as I splash around in 16th century waters, which are not my most natural habitat. It's also possible that someone of you out there might know those answers. If so, believe me, I'll be delighted to learn and not at all put out if you need to set me straight, though I would ask you please to hold fire until the end of the paper rather than stealing what thunder I have by solving the riddle before I've fully described it. To begin with the manuscripts, with many thanks for much of what follows to Daniel Hughes's forthcoming repertory of Welsh manuscripts and to Anne Parry Owen for making drafts available to me of some of the relevant entries. Peniarth 147 consists of two distinct parts bound together. The first and larger part is in the hand of William David Llywelyn, a physician, scribe and recusant from Llangynyder in Brycheiniog. His known works span the second half of the 16th century and into the beginning of the 17th, but in Daniel's judgment, this manuscript belongs to his earlier period, before the 1580s, and he suggests circa 1570. The key datable item in the work is a list of Oxford colleges and their dates of establishment. This gets to 1566, but does not include the foundation of Jesus College in 1571. This evidently accounts for Evans's dating to circa 1566, that's Gwenogradrin Evans, the editor of the text in the reports of Welsh manuscripts at the end of the 19th century. Though technically in or after 1566 would be more accurate than circa 1566. The list of colleges is one of a miscellany of items, including heraldry, cerddant, and some literary fragments, but the beginning of the manuscript in particular is taken up with a series of thematically linked geographical texts. The first item, a list of cantrefi and cymydau, then our parish list, and then shortly afterwards a description of Britain, which is illustrated here. These other items are quite distinct in origin, I think. The list of cantrefi is found in medieval versions, but clearly they've been brought together as a coherent group in this manuscript. To expand on that slightly, the list of parishes, which is annoyingly written, unlike very legible items elsewhere in the book, in something approaching invisible ink, or at least ink that is faint and fading, is clearly, as it stands, a text of the mid-16th century. This is because while it assigns the places to the traditional Welsh unit of the cwmwd or comote, its primary divisions are the Tair Sir Ardeg, the 13 counties of Wales. These counties came into being as the result of Henry VIII's legislation, the so-called Act of Union of 1536. Unless the list of places has been much reorganised, not impossible, but there are no positive indications to support the idea, it seems likely to have come into being between 1536 and circa 1570, the date of this earliest manuscript witness. The earliest manuscript witness, because up to now I've talked as if Peniarth 147 is a unique text, but now I have to fess up. Here's the full first page of Evans's edition. You've seen the top half on Sir Vaughan, but there is the bottom, the footnote, and I have a larger version of that, listing numerous variant readings from other manuscripts. At this stage, Evans had identified 3 further manuscripts, one of which contained 2 different versions of the list, and he attempted here to indicate the variants and differences with a rather elaborate system of footnotes using numbers, letters, and symbols, with plenty of square brackets and footnotes within the footnotes for good measure. It's tricky to use, and if you do follow it through, it's not entirely accurate, as it turns out. All of this is really going to need a new look. And indeed, the list of manuscripts and versions is growing. Here's what I found to date, and there may well be more lurking in the pages of the repertory when it appears. There'll be quite a job of collation to do to make secure sense of them all, and I've really only just made a start, and mostly on the basis of sampling Anglesey. But what I have found, and what is fairly clear, is that the relationships can be summarized something like this. There is one substantial main version, or at least the one that accounts for most of the surviving manuscripts, and that is represented by Peniarth 147. There is then another recension, National Library of Wales 872D, which is distinct in quite a lot of ways. And it has there are 2 manuscripts, they're from Edward Floyd's Parochialia, where the county of Denbighshire is copied quite possibly from National Library of Wales 872, and those manuscripts, Rawlinson and the other National Library manuscript, may be derived directly from it. So it's a relatively simple distribution, or at least it was, until I came across Peniarth 226, another manuscript of around 1600, which does have elements of both and rather confuses matters. A lot more work needs to go into that before I can turn this sort of diagram into a stemma that I would believe in as to what is copied from what. But lurking behind them is an archetype, an original compilation, which I have called Lambda, for reasons I wanted to avoid Omicron, obviously, but for reasons that will become apparent in due course. Those 3 manuscripts. The most distinct variant version, National Library of Wales 872D, is written by none less than John Davis of Mallwyd, at some point in the first half of the 17th century. It's a good deal more legible than the Peniarth version. And I can illustrate some of the nature of the distinctions between them with these examples. Peniarth 147 incorporates occasional notes on the places in passing. One here from Anglesey on Penmynydd, which is known here by the church dedication as Llan Rhydfel for St Gredifail. And the loyalist Welshman here has proudly noted that it was the seat of the Tudor family, which had come to the throne with Henry VII, Harry Seithfed, earlier in the 16th century. More typical, indeed rather more common throughout the text, and of course that is the pile at Penmynydd in a photograph from the Royal Commission on the right there. More typical, indeed rather common throughout the text, is the addition of a note on market days, as we have at the top. There is a market there every Saturday at Casnewydd, Newport in Monmouthshire. Those are dotted throughout the text. It might be observed that, though it's difficult to make out from these images, I accept, that these notes, which read like original marginal additions to a bald list of places, are written continuously within the text. In other words, if they started life as marginal editions, they did so in an earlier manuscript, and they've been incorporated in this one. It's one of a number of clues suggesting that although it's our earliest surviving record of the list, the Peniarth 147 text is a copy and not the original publication. These lists are missing, these comments are missing from John Davis's manuscript. But this also has many additions to the bare list of names, but they're different in detail and mostly different in character. Typical are these from Denbighshire, where to place names like Cerrig-y-Drudion and Gwytherin have been added the patron saints of their churches, which incidentally are of more than slight interest, because the recovery of Welsh church dedications after the Reformation is not a straightforward business, and this is a very early source for it. And occasionally there is a rather more expansive note, like that here for Cyffylltiog, which rather splendidly implies a connection between a cyffyll, a wooden box in the church, an oak box that held the image of Mary, and the place name, although modern views on the place name tend to prefer tree stumps as the explanation for the cyffyll there. Above all, Davis's version contains a significantly higher number of names. In Anglesey, which I studied closely, it has 88 as against Peniarth 74. We'll have a look at just what those names represent in a moment, but there are various indications that the higher number is an expansion of a lower original rather than the reverse. Here we seem to catch John Davis Asset in Denbighshire, for instance, with 2 marginal additions. The first 8 names in Anglesey are these, 6 of them represented on this modern map. And so, and in fact, the other 2, we need to hunt a bit on older maps. So Llanferian is represented there by St Marion's Church, just to the southeast of Llangadwalada, and Llanguifan is there on a modern map, but it's in derived names plus Llanguifan and the church. We need to go again to an older map to see the remains of St Cuivan's Church that was there in the 19th century. In fact, it's still marked, it's not named on that Ordnance Survey map. Identifying these places in this way indicates that they all have something in common, but it's not that they are or were parishes. Rather, it is that they have or had churches. There were 5 parishes in Mathtraeth, for instance, in the 16th century. I'll tell you how I know that in a moment. And 8 names are listed. 3 of them were chapels subordinate to their parishes. There we are. And in neighbouring Llifon, just 3 of the named places are parishes. The other 12 are either chapels of those parishes or of others lying in other commotes. Bodwrwg, Bodeden, Llandrygon, for instance, were chapels of Caergybi, Holyhead. So this is, from all I've seen so far, a list of churches, not of parishes. The list includes chapels as well as parish churches. It also excludes contemporary secular settlements that had no church. We'll see some examples of those shortly. The distinction between parish and church may seem a pedantic one, but it really shouldn't be, especially in the context of the early modern or medieval periods. The parish was a fundamentally significant unit in Wales, in England, and indeed across Europe. Chapels were local foundations subsidiary to and financially dependent on parish churches, typically established, often, though not always, at a relatively late date, for the convenience of worshippers in a large dispersed parishes. It's therefore frankly perplexing to find that Gwenogfren's title, A List of the Parishes of Wales, is not a modern editor's oversight, but is sanctioned by practically all of the manuscripts. Peniarth 147 concludes its list by stating Ac felly terfyna cyfri plwyfia tair sir a ddeg, and so ends the reckoning of the parishes of the 13 counties. And you may have noticed that it starts its list by spelling out Plwy Llan Gydwalder before heading every single subsequent entry with P for Plwy, even though so many examples are demonstrably not parishes. I wondered if the semantics of Welsh Plwy were more flexible than the English equivalent, but I've seen no other evidence for it. And it may be significant that the actual title, that's to say the heading that precedes the list in Peniarth 147, does not mention Plwy parishes, but the authorial voice, sonion, we will speak of, towns, cities, cymydau, and churches, eglwysydd. This seems to me a better representation of the text, though even here I have my suspicions about towns and cities, except insofar as places of status will almost inevitably have had churches. I think this is in origin a list of churches in Wales, and I'm not sure that any of the descriptions or titles in the manuscripts that I have seen so far go back to the original compiler. That churches are front and central to the organisational principle is not just a conclusion drawn from the contents of the list, but also tends to be supported by its form. Any list of major place names in Wales tends to be dominated by the generic element llan, of course, early meaning an enclosure, but early in the medieval period gaining a special, almost exclusive association with churchyards and churches. The Peniarth list appears to go out of its way to promote names in llan. Take these three places on Anglesey, for example, two of which we've met already. Llangaenwen, the Church of Caenwen, is Cerrig Caenwen now, and has been Cerrig Caenwen, or Carreg Caenwen, in records, many of them ecclesiastical in nature, since the 13th century. I mentioned Llandrydfel in Penmynydd, which again is otherwise always the secular Penmynydd. Again, on Anglesey, and particularly striking, is the case of Amlwch, which is not mentioned here under that name, but which offers a Llan name combined with the church dedication to Elaeth, sometimes as here, Elaeth Frenin. Once more, the place and its church are recorded back to the 13th century, but this list seems to be the only source which calls it Llan Elaeth rather than Amlwch. So where does this come from? Very briefly, I'm going to skip through four options. Number one, ecclesiastical lists. These are familiar. They go back to 13th century papal lists compiled for papal taxation. And then there's this particularly proximate one, the Valor Ecclesiasticus of 1535, Henry VIII drawing up a list of the churches so that he could tax them. These provide countrywide records, though the earlier medieval ones have various gaps and limitations, and could have offered, if they were available to a Welsh scholar, a ready-made national list. This is certainly possible, though there are reasons to be wary of the explanation. For one thing, the lists of churches are not identical. The centralised records are rather monolithic. If someone had access to them, and I'm not sure how generally accessible they were in the second half of the 16th century, one might expect the selection of names and the order in which they appear to be traceable in the derived copy. I haven't seen that, at least not yet. The Valor, for example, includes a fair number of churches not found in Peniarth 147 and omits some that are. And the ordering seems to me particularly important. The Valor, like other institutional ecclesiastical records, respects the hierarchy. Parishes are preeminent, chapels are secondary to them and listed after their parishes. In Peniarth 147, although there is certainly some geographical coherence, a lot of geographical coherence, the ecclesiastical hierarchy is not paramount, with chapels sometimes separated by a few entries from their parish and sometimes preceding it. If not an ecclesiastical list, what about this? We saw Llwyd's famous work of the 1560s. He was soon to be followed by Saxton, whose county maps of Wales were published in 1578 or 9, I forget. These offer a similar density of coverage, though again, not all the same, though not, again, not all is the same in detail. Names here, which are not on Peniarth 147, include Cerchiog, at the top of the screen there, modern Cerchiog, for example. And of course, the forms of the names are quite different. I could have made this point with the Valor or any of the other contemporary or earlier records. Peniarth 147 is distinctively Welsh in its orthography and name choices. We'll look more closely at that later on. Not that orthography is the only distinction. At the bottom here, you'll see Llanddwyn Wen, which is Llanddwyn in Peniarth 147. A distinct choice of variants of the saint's name, known as both Dwyn and Dwyn Wen. And incidentally, on secular settlements that are not included in Peniarth 147, there are lots of them here. You can see there's a different symbol. Churches have a little cross beside them. Secular settlements, Hendragadog, Boddon, Trefarthyn over here, do not have that cross, and none of those are included in our list of churches. A third option, if he's not got it from a map or a list, an ecclesiastical list, is records gathered around the country. This is a list of Anglesey places, churches on the left, other features on the right, apparently supplied to John Leland by an informant, probably a man called Roland Griffith, in the 1530s. Such lists from each county or region gathered together could again underlie the composition of the national list. And there were undoubtedly local gentlemen scholars, most of them men, it would appear, who could have contributed to such a venture. Note that this, however compiled, does distinguish and arrange chapels under parishes. Again, there are variations in details and coverage, suggesting that this itself is not one of the sources used in compiling Peniarth 147. And the problem for it as a theory is the lack of evidence, so far as I'm aware, for any of the constituent texts or the network that would have produced it surviving. Edward Floyd and his parochial queries were nearly a century and a half in the future. He wrote around the country and requested information. Got no indication of that in this particular case. There are other options. This is a genealogical list, a list of achai, which are assigned to settlements with distinctively Welsh names. This from the middle of the 16th century. This sort of thing could be a source. It's not arranged ecclesiastically. Indeed, it's actually quite difficult to work out, apart from the clan names, which would be churches and which would not. But there is information out there. It's just a question of whether we can recognize a potential direct source for the list that we're interested in. The fourth option is, of course, the most exciting one in a way, of travel. Does it represent a data gathering exercise on horseback or on foot? Leland, of course, famously in the 1530s, travelled around Wales, and he stands at the head of the early modern humanists and antiquarians, the rediscovery of Britain and its cultures and its topography and its past. He left us a text like this, mentioning lots of Welsh place names in passing. Is our anonymous Welsh language text a native parallel to Leland's rather famous expedition? If so, it seems to have left no record in history. No one seems to know about it, unless somebody out there does. And Saxton, I said that Saxton's map is unlikely to be a direct source. The date's wrong, apart from anything else. But what about the process of collecting it? I gather that Saxton scholars know very little about how Saxton went about surveying and gathering his information. But one of the things they do know by chance is a letter, an open letter from the Privy Council relating to his data gathering in Wales specifically. A letter that allows that asks for the help of local people in gathering that data. The said justices shall be aiding and assisting unto him to see him conducted unto any tower, castle, high place, or hill to view that country, and that he might be accompanied with 2 or 3 honest men, such as do best know the country for the better accomplishment of that service, and that at his departure from any town or place that he has taken the view of the said town, to set forth a horseman that can speak both Welsh and English, to safe conduct him to the next market town. So people were traveling around Wales in this period and collecting material, but the ones we know about inevitably are rather famous and have left rather marked monuments with their names attached to them, as it were. What is our text one of those for Wales? Is it a traveller? Again, the text itself, although this is, I don't think this is a proof, the text could be arranged in the form of an itinerary, of a journey from one place to another. That could give a hint. I say it's geographically coherent, but it's not entirely geographically coherent. It's not obviously, it's a rather mixed up itinerary if this is the record of travel round the comet. Didn't go a particularly direct way. It's also, if it is an itinerary, if it does represent a journey, it seems to me a very, very kind of mean output from that journey, but perhaps that's just a modern view looking back, but not leaving us any prose apart from the occasional note on when the markets were, and otherwise just a list of places. Seems like a very sort of focused data gathering exercise, given all the things that you might be writing down if you were recording a journey around the whole country. I don't know. That was where I had got to in my thinking when I discovered this. This is a lecture that was given to the National Eisteddfod in Ebble Vale in Monmouthshire in 1958 by G.J. Williams. And he begins that lecture by pointing out that Monmouthshire was thoroughly Welsh-speaking until relatively recent times. In the 16th century, when a Welshman, Llywelyn ap Meredydd ap Llelo Gwta, made a tour of the 13 counties of Wales, he could give the Welsh names of all the parishes in this part of Monmouthshire. The names that he had heard, Dintan Uchaf and Dintan Isaf, Castell Gwent for Casgwent, Porthsgwed, Dre Newydd, Gelli Fach for Shire Newton, Magwyr for Magor, Gundi for Undi, etc. And the fact that such beautiful place names have survived until the present day, and the fact that Old English names of parishes are few and far between, proves that those areas were predominantly Welsh throughout the centuries. We have only to compare the place names of Monmouthshire with those of Gower and southern Pembrokeshire, which lost some of their Welsh features in the Middle Ages. Goodness, I was taken aback by this because I had heard of Llelo Gwta, and I'll show you in what context in a way. But that he made a tour of the 13 counties of Wales. What does G.J. Williams know that I don't? Is there a source that's missing? Well, I think I found it. So I was familiar with the name of Llelo Gwta because he comes up in a couple of the manuscripts. Well, he had come up already in a couple of the manuscripts as owning a manuscript, Llyfr Llywelyn ap Meredydd alias Llelo Gwta, rather than ap Llelo Gwta. Llelo the short, possibly used of a very tall man, who knows. His manuscript was given as the source of the copy in John Davies's manuscript, and also it is mentioned in those copies of Denbighshire in the Parochialia, which I mentioned, which are derived from John Davies's manuscript. And I thought, aha, John Davis has got his variant version from a manuscript of Llelo Gutta. Further researches have found that Llelo turns up in other manuscripts in the collection, other versions. Hyn a dynodd William Salisbury, allan o lyfr Llywelyn ap Meredydd alias Llelo in 1563. That attribution is also found in British Library manuscript and then another British Library manuscript. They're all mentioning the manuscript copy as a source for the versions that they've got, which makes me suspect that if not the archetype, then something pretty close to it was in a book that belonged to Llywelyn ap Meredydd, Llelo Gutta, which existed by 1563, if William Salisbury copied it then, if that's what that note means. Again, imagine my surprise when the last substantial manuscript that I've looked at has this, Siroedd Holl Gymru, a trefi a phob eglwys a marchnatoedd. So no parishes, you know, the shires of all Wales, the towns and every church and the markets, allan o lyfr, so out of the book of Llywelyn ap Meredydd alias Llelo Gutta, a gerddodd y tair sir ar ddeg ac ei sgrifennodd ei llaw ei hun, who walked the 13 counties and wrote it down in his own hand. Goodness. Llelo is very little known. He's not in the Biographiadur. But he is known as the author of one manuscript, a different British Library manuscript, not one that has this list in, so not the llyfr that they're talking about, a book written in 1552, so it's the right period, which survives with some of his poetry. He may, according to Daniel, have come from Denbighshire. I'm not sure what the evidence for that is, and he apparently died, according to a note in the manuscript that he owned, in Ludlow. So the question is, do we trust Thomas Williams, who was writing circa 1600, Peniarth 226? It's writing much closer to the events than we are, but on the other hand, 40 or 50 years after the supposed journeying, if we trust the 1563 date for an earlier manuscript. Or is he extrapolating from the nature of the list? Does he know what I knew until I saw Peniarth 226, which is that there was an early version of this list in a manuscript ascribed to Llelo Gutta? That doesn't mean that he wrote it, and it certainly doesn't mean that he walked around the country. Is this Thomas Williams assuming from the nature of the text that it's a journey, or does he know something that I don't? Perhaps somebody out there does. If we're tempted to think twice about G.J. Williams's acceptance of that fact, we might then consider his further arguments. I have no quarrel with the Welsh-speaking status of much of Monmouthshire's population in the 16th century, but are the forms collected by Llelo or someone the forms passed on by local Welsh speakers in the way that he suggests? And I ask the question because here's a selection of modern views on individual name forms from the list in Peniarth 147. Most of these from the Dictionary of Place Names of Wales, sort of standard reference work by now by Howell Winowen and Richard Morgan. Of individual names, they're saying a Welsh translation probably had no currency as a place name. The Welsh form does not seem to appear in other sources. The Welsh form seems to be antiquarian, probably unreliable, probably antiquarian, and so on. Maybe literary or ecclesiastical form. The source has a number of unreliable spellings, a list which corrected or over-grammaticized Welsh place names. So not a ringing endorsement from modern scholarship for some of the forms provided in this manuscript. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but in order to form any kind of opinion, just we'll have a quick look at some of the nature of the names in the list. And now I'll stop obsessing on Anglesey and cast my net more widely around the country. To put my cards on the table, the list undoubtedly gives a detailed and valuable record of the development of for the development of Welsh place names that are still in use, Welsh place names that are still in use. The examples on this slide are names that are now known only in Welsh form. You'll see why I'm making that distinction in a moment. So at the top, we've got examples of names that are. I said that most major place names are recorded earlier in the Middle Ages, but actually there are some here that are first recorded in this list, like Ashmawr, Llanarmon, and so on. That particular Llanarmon. Llangrannog is an interesting one because that was previously known as Ogof, with reference to a cave on the Cardiganshire coast, but this is the first one to do the typical list thing of replacing it with Llan plus the saint's name, Crannog, though in this particular case it stuck, whether due to this list or more likely due to adoption locally. The place or church of Llanfihangel Nant Mellan is recorded earlier, but in English or Latin form, St Michael of Nant Mellan in 1231, for instance. So the Welsh ecclesiastical form, again, typically for this list, comes in here for the first time, and it's the form that has survived. More common than those firsts, if you like, is the addition by the Peniarth list of a locative affix, I've called it there. It's the first source to add distinguishing affixes to some of these names. So Llanbadarn was previously recorded, but Llanbadarn Garreg, Garreg, in the Peniarth form is first found here, and so with Gwent and Cennin and Arvain, it's Vaen. It's a river name in origin, Llandelo, Arvan, and so on. The addition of those affixes, which have been taken into modern use, may be something to do with the sort of national scope of this list. If you're copying a list with compiling a list with several Llanbadarns or several Llanbedars in, then adding an affix to distinguish them becomes a useful thing to do. And it may be that, on the other hand, a point I will be making shortly, they are appropriate local affixes. They're not affixes that have been imposed by somebody sitting in Denbighshire or whatever. Much more common for firsts comes when we look at names that are now known with distinct modern forms in English and Welsh. And here there are tens and tens, 40 odd on this slide, and I'm sure I haven't got all of them, where the distinctive Welsh form is first found in our Peniarth 147 list, at least according to the sort of standard reference books. It must be said that some of this I'm kind of hostage to the materials that are available, because there may be earlier Welsh forms in other sources that haven't been collected, of course, but one has to do a great deal of research on each name to come to that conclusion. And so this is a kind of overview of this is how it looks at the moment. It's striking that hardly any of these names, very few of these names at least, are of the sort of Swansea Abertawe type, where the two names have no formal or lexical relationship between the linguistic options. Leatherston, Trevellyn appears to be one in Pembrokeshire. Monmouth, Trevernwy could be counted another on something of a technicality. They both involve the river name. In Browdy, Llanmartin, Llanir, of which more shortly, Pontfaen, Tenby, originally Welsh names are just are rendered in apparently properly Welsh form for the first time. But most of them are Welsh forms, translations, or equivalents of English names recorded earlier in every case, though whether necessarily they were coined earlier is always a difficult judgment to make. Norton, an English name, mildly cumbricized, or tin. Gromont, originally French, and given a Welsh name which has survived as the standard equivalent, and appears for the first time in this source. Another distinctive feature which we've talked about already is the ecclesiastical nature of these names, of course. The substitution of a dedication and plan for a name of a different type, or the addition of a church dedication to a name that already existed. In some cases, these are supported by other evidence to suggest that the name had some currency, but in many cases they're unique to this list. There's a sort of conceptual question here, if we accept that this is first and foremost a list of churches rather than the places, in that how far these should be accounted variant place name forms, because it's always a very blurry question in Wales, where the association of churches and units of settlement and administration are so close, and settlements so often bear ecclesiastical names, that many sources show some flexibility between ecclesiastical naming and topographical or secular ones. Though in this source, the distinction is particularly marked. Another very marked characteristic of quite different type is the deployment of the definite article. Again, sometimes this is supported by other sources, sometimes it's found in modern usage, and sometimes it's unique to this text. The one at the bottom there gives an example, Tregear, I suspect that's pronounced, Tregear, the settlement of the fort, gives a sort of a definiteness rather than fort settlement. Not a great deal of difference, but it's a very clear characteristic that this happens again and again in this source, and it's done to extend, one suspects, to sort of pull into a Welsh net a number of names not Welsh in origin, like a Verwig, originally in English Berwick, outlying farm, or a Malpas, French Malpas, bad, difficult passage, difficult place to get through. Produces a very bizarre outcome occasionally in another French name, Morville, transferred from a place in France, one of many places in France called Morville, settlement of Maurus, a Roman name originally, personal name, and that becomes a Morville in the lists usage, which of course has a different meaning entirely for Welsh speakers. The Wale, unlikely place name in Pembrokeshire. Modern usage often varies in this characteristic, and it's hard to say how far these examples, even the odd ones, might reflect local usage, but they clearly indicate a tendency in the list to choose forms that appear Welsh and demotic. Okay, how are we doing? Right, this last 5 minutes. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples to consider, indeed practically the whole nomenclature of the towns and villages of Wales. But to finish, I'll select a handful that might have a bearing on the questions raised earlier on the nature of the list. And I can begin with a couple cited by G.J. Williams. Casgwent for Chepstow is a name that, in fact, had a completely different name in 1086 Domesday, but we should pass over as Treboil, which is an obscure name. It's Castell Gwent in 1128 in the Book of Llandav, and then after that is forms of Chepstow, Old English Chepstow, marketplace, which take over for centuries. Castell Gwent in circa 1566, again, as far as the records appear to show, is the first time that's been used since the 12th century. So it's not fake, whatever it is, it's well researched. It might be drawing on old records, or it might be current and reflect the survival of the name in the local community in just the way that G.J. Williams suggested. It's certainly not made up. Shire Newton, Drenewydd Gelli Fach, the grove of the horse. Drenewydd clearly equivalent. Newton Drenewydd, one's a translation of the other, a new town. The shire in Shire Newton is actually a sheriff, and there's an association with the Sheriff of Gloucester, apparently, which may account for that. Gelli Fach comes out of nowhere, is nowhere else recorded, but does remain the standard name in the current lists. But again, but in this case, surely reflects some form of local knowledge, simply on the grounds that how would you generate that otherwise as a local place name? Seems very unlikely to be pulled from thin air, and it's not much, although Bach, horse, sheriff, knight, there might be some sort of relationship between the two, but it seems not unlikely that it's a genuine local Welsh form collected, however that collection was done in the middle of the 16th century. And I put the map up partly to show that although there are bits of, despite G.J. Williams, there are bits of Monmouthshire where a lot of the minor names, where very few of the minor names preserved any kind of Welsh form, suggesting that the language may have gone at a relatively early date. Shire Newton is not one of them. Mynydd Bach, Argoed, Maes y Gwenydd. There's a good number of clearly Welsh names in the immediate vicinity, which would indicate the potential, at least, that a Welsh name would have survived into a relatively late period. I've got lots of other examples that, to my mind, suggest that the names in the list are kind of perfectly fine. They're local in one form or another. They're well researched in one form or another. They're not suspicious in quite the way that all of those quotes suggested. Abernant is shown by its earliest spellings actually to include a relatively old archaic plural of abers, ebir. That's what you get in circa 1566, which again, our list. It's not what you've got in the Valor Ecclesiasticus of 1535, so he's not pulled it from there, but he's got a form that is appropriate and could very well have been local. And even, showing something rather different in the case of Cardiff, the Caer on the River Tav, of course, an old genitival place now. But the sound change which took place in this name within Welsh of the to the, so that you end up with Caerdydd, is actually first attested in 1555. The earliest form we've got of that name that I've seen is from 1555. And so our list from the following decade or so is local and up to date for that name. It wouldn't impose on the place from a distance. Perhaps Cardiff is a name that is likely to have been known anyway, although not as important then as it became subsequently, of course. So I would say that the weight of much of the evidence is in favour of these names as being genuine 16th century forms of considerable value. But there are some very suspicious things about the list as well, around the edges. Llanllir is one example that's been written about quite recently. That looks like it might be a name in Llwyn and not Llan, and there's no other spelling in the collections to suggest ll in Llyr. Llwyn here is probably the best guess, and despite the local church being dedicated to a St. Llyr, it is very likely that that dedication has been pulled from the standard Welsh version of the place name, which in itself depends ultimately on Peniarth 147. Di Hawkins recently wrote specifically along those lines, based solely on an apostolic succession, as it were, from a single corrupt text of circa 1566. I think the corruption is going a bit far, but I do think that there is something wrong with that form. There's also a tendency within the list to perhaps look for meaning where meaning is not easy to find within Welsh. Llanfihangel Bryn Pabian. Pabian is probably a personal name, but it's not entirely clear and obvious. And the list comes up with Llanfihangel Bryn Pine, where pine, is that peacocks? Peacocks on a hill. There's the occasional form that looks as if it might be trying too hard to find sense, and isn't necessarily a locally transmitted form. And this is my favourite example of things going a bit wrong, I think, although I'm not entirely sure, because it's a very difficult name. But Freystrop in Pembrokeshire is maybe an Old Norse personal name, maybe an Old Norse place name. It's certainly a sort of Middle English Anglo personal name. The second element is Thorpe or Throp, a secondary settlement. And the first element would appear to be a personal name involving Freyst. There's an etymology within Old Norse that could work. It's even been suggested that that it's a Freya, a deity name, sort of Viking pre-Christian name, which seems to me pushing the evidence, but it's a serious suggestion in a relatively recent publication. Anyway, it's a name of an English, Anglo-Norse, Middle English kind of background. And a difficult one for our compiler to deal with came up with Freyster Gam. And I think which doesn't even get into the books about Freystrop. People haven't recognized it as a form of this name, but it's in the right commode and it starts Freyst, so I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I think that's been understood as a personal name, Freyster, and I think Gam might be from reading that as Freyster Hop, and then Gam would be a Welsh byname meaning meaning lame. Hence Hop. That's the best guess that I can come up with anyway, to make any kind of sense of why that might have happened. And another, time is getting on, I'm going to jump on. Another misunderstanding, I think, there by our list. One further very quick point, which is that if the Anglicizations are under some degree, or if the Cymricizations of English names or non-Welsh names are under some sort of degree of suspicion, it's worth pointing out that they are not consistently done across the country by any means. Some tunes become tre. Tun, Old English tun, tun, sometimes bizarrely goes the other way and becomes town. Or it becomes a Welsh tune. Different names within the same area are treated differently here. We saw Nortyn in North East Wales as well. There doesn't seem to me to be an overall editorial hand making the same sorts of decisions about Cymricising names, which again, that would be a truly artificial thing to be doing in the compilation of this list. And I don't think that's what's going on either. So, some conclusions to finish. I believe the evidence of Llelo enough to say that this is a list that was probably written down in or before 1563 by Llywelyn ap Meredydd, alias Llelo Gwta, though whether he was the first person to write it down, I'm not so sure about. It's certainly a list of churches rather than a list of parishes. Its main claim to fame, as it were, is that it consistently records Welsh names, and it uses Welsh orthography. And it goes in for Cymricising English names, and occasionally excessively. Though I would say that the differences in the way that that's done would suggest that this isn't necessarily the work of one compiler, but may indeed be a work of compilation. It may be a work of pulling together forms that have been Cymricised differently by different people in different parts of the country. And we're left with the two big questions. I still don't really know which of my possible explanations I've suggested as to how or why it was compiled. And I'm left hanging as, was it Llelo? Did he walk around Wales? Are we to believe in that account? I don't know. And that's me.
Well, diolch yn fawr iawn, David. That was a really fascinating talk there.